What if I told you there are places where corruption is not just a hidden act, but an everyday reality, impacting millions of lives, fueling inequality, and crippling economies? These nations are not just plagued by scandals, but are trapped in cycles of systemic corruption that seem impossible to break. Today, we uncover the truth about the 10 most corrupt countries in 2025 and how their stories reveal a grim picture of power and greed. Stay with us until the end as we expose the shocking details you won't find elsewhere. Corruption is a disease that eats away at nations from within, draining resources, diminishing public trust, and leaving citizens in despair. While every country faces its challenges, some stand out for all the wrong reasons. In this video, we'll dive deep into the 10 most corrupt countries in 2025, backed by the latest Corruption Perceptions Index. From failed governments to oppressive regimes, these nations have become infamous for corruption levels so staggering that they shape daily life. Let's begin this eye-opening journey. Number 1. Somalia. Somalia tops the list yet again in 2025, with a dismal corruption score of 11. But why has this East African nation remained at the bottom of the corruption rankings year after year? The answer lies in a deadly combination of weak governance, clan politics, and unchecked criminal networks. Somalia's government struggles to extend its authority beyond the capital, Mogadishu. Instead, power is often in the hands of warlords, extremist groups, or corrupt officials who exploit the country's resources for personal gain. The lack of transparency in government contracts, international aid misuse, and even interference in elections have left ordinary Somalis with little hope for change. But what's most shocking is how corruption affects the humanitarian crisis. Did you know that aid meant to help starving children often ends up in the black market? Somalia's story is one of unfulfilled promises and a reminder of how corruption can devastate a nation's future. Number 2. Syria. In a country already torn apart by a decade-long civil war, corruption in Syria has reached unimaginable heights. With a CPI score of just 13, the regime and rebel groups alike exploit civilians to fund their own agendas. Syria's government is infamous for bribery at all levels, from securing basic goods to obtaining permits. But it doesn't end there. Reconstruction funds meant to rebuild war-torn areas often disappear into the hands of officials, leaving millions homeless. Meanwhile, smuggling and illegal trade flourish under the watch of complicit authorities, ensuring that the cycle of corruption feeds itself. What makes Syria's corruption even more heartbreaking is the human toll it takes. Imagine needing to pay a bribe just to access medical care for a wounded loved one. That's the grim reality for many Syrians. Stay tuned, because as we climb this list, the stories only get more shocking. Number 3. South Sudan. South Sudan gained independence in 2011 with hopes of becoming Africa's newest success story. Instead, it became one of the world's most corrupt nations. With a CPI score of 13, this young country is plagued by mismanagement, ethnic conflict, and leaders who treat the nation's wealth as their personal bank account. South Sudan's oil revenue, which could have transformed the country, often vanishes into offshore accounts. Meanwhile, public servants go months without pay, hospitals lack basic supplies, and millions are displaced due to conflict fueled by greed. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect is how corruption impacts humanitarian aid. Even as international organizations send help to combat famine and disease, much of it is intercepted or resold by corrupt officials. It's a harsh reminder that corruption is not just about money, it's about lives. Number 4. Venezuela. Once one of South America's wealthiest nations, Venezuela now ranks as one of the most corrupt, with a CPI score of 13. The government's grip on power and misuse of resources have plunged the nation into economic and political chaos. At the heart of Venezuela's corruption is the mismanagement of its oil industry. which once accounted for 90% of export earnings. Instead of benefiting the people, oil revenue has been siphoned off by officials to fund luxurious lifestyles while citizens face food shortages, inflation, and poverty. But what keeps this system running? A network of loyalists in the military and judiciary ensures that any dissent is crushed. Bribery is a way of life, from securing passports to finding basic medicine. Venezuela's story is a cautionary tale of how corruption can bring even the richest nations to their knees. Number 5. Yemen. Yemen's ongoing civil war has created one of the worst humanitarian crises in modern history. Yet, even amidst this suffering, corruption thrives, with a CPI score of 16. The country's fractured government, competing factions, and economic collapse have created the perfect environment for corrupt practices. From inflated military contracts to the manipulation of international aid, Yemen's leaders prioritize their own wealth over the survival of their people. Even food supplies meant for starving families are often stolen and sold on the black market. Yemen's story is a heartbreaking example of how corruption compounds human suffering, turning a dire situation into an unbearable one. And as we continue, you'll see just how global this problem is. Number 6. Libya. Libya, with a CPI score of 17, is a tragic example of how a nation's vast wealth can become a curse when corruption takes root. Decades of dictatorship, followed by years of instability, have turned Libya into a breeding ground for graft, bribery, and misuse of resources. Libya's oil reserves, once seen as a blessing, are now a source of power struggles. Factions compete for control over oil fields, using the nation's wealth to fund their own interests rather than rebuild the country. Public funds often disappear into the hands of corrupt officials, leaving citizens with crumbling infrastructure, power shortages, and poor health care. Even more shocking is how Libya's corruption extends to human trafficking. The country has become a hub for smuggling migrants to Europe, with officials often turning a blind eye or directly profiting from the trade. Libya's descent into corruption and chaos shows how the absence of accountability can destroy a nation's potential. Number 7. Equatorial Guinea. Equatorial Guinea ranks as one of the most corrupt nations, with a CPI score of 17. Despite being one of Africa's largest oil producers, the wealth of this nation remains concentrated in the hands of a select few. The ruling elite live in luxury, while the majority of the population struggles in poverty. The government's misuse of oil revenues is at the core of Equatorial Guinea's corruption. Mansions, private jets, and lavish lifestyles for top officials contrast starkly with the country's underfunded hospitals and schools. Public funds that could improve citizens' lives are often funneled into offshore accounts, leaving the nation dependent on foreign aid for basic needs. What makes Equatorial Guinea's story even more frustrating is the lack of transparency. Independent journalists and activists who expose corruption face intimidation and imprisonment, ensuring that the truth remains hidden. This small but resource-rich country highlights the devastating impact of unchecked greed. Number 8. North Korea. North Korea, with a CPI score of 17, is one of the world's most isolated and secretive nations, making it a breeding ground for corruption. Under the authoritarian rule of Kim Jong-un, the state controls every aspect of life, and corruption is deeply entrenched in both the government and society. Bribery is an everyday reality for North Koreans. Want better food rations? Pay a bribe. Need to avoid punishment for minor infractions? Pay a bribe. Even crossing the border illegally requires paying off officials. Corruption has become a survival strategy for ordinary citizens. Meanwhile, the regime uses state resources to fund its nuclear ambitions and luxurious lifestyles for the ruling elite. International aid intended for the people often ends up being diverted to the military or black market sales. North Korea is a chilling example of how corruption can thrive under a totalitarian system where transparency and accountability are non-existent. Number 9. Burundi. Burundi, with a CPI score of 17, is one of the poorest countries in the world, and corruption plays a significant role in keeping it that way. The nation's fragile political system is riddled with nepotism, embezzlement, and bribery, which undermine development and keep the majority of the population in poverty. Public funds meant for infrastructure, education, and healthcare are often stolen by officials or mismanaged. For example, roads and hospitals are frequently left unfinished, despite millions of dollars allocated to such projects. Citizens must often pay bribes to access basic services, like education, or obtain government documents. Even foreign aid, which Burundi heavily relies on, is not immune to corruption. Officials often misuse these funds, leaving international donors hesitant to invest in the country's development. Burundi's case illustrates how systemic corruption can trap a nation in a vicious cycle of poverty and underdevelopment. Number 10. Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan, with a CPI score of 18, is one of the most corrupt and repressive countries in the world. Its authoritarian government tightly controls the economy, media, and society, creating an environment where corruption thrives unchecked. The country's vast natural gas reserves could have transformed it into a regional powerhouse, but instead, these resources are monopolized by the ruling elite. Contracts are awarded based on favoritism, and revenues often disappear into opaque government accounts. Meanwhile, the majority of Turkmen citizens live in poverty, with limited access to clean water, healthcare, or education. Perhaps most disturbing is the culture of fear that surrounds corruption in Turkmenistan. Whistleblowers and journalists who expose wrongdoing face imprisonment or worse, ensuring that corruption remains hidden from the outside world. Turkmenistan's story is a stark reminder of how authoritarian regimes use corruption as a tool to maintain power and suppress dissent. These 10 nations reveal how corruption can destroy economies, deepen inequality, and shatter the hopes of millions. But the fight against corruption is far from hopeless. Around the world, ordinary citizens, journalists, and organizations are taking a stand, demanding transparency and accountability from their leaders. Corruption may seem like an insurmountable challenge, but history shows us that change is possible. In our next video, we'll explore how some countries have successfully tackled corruption and improved the lives of their citizens. Don't miss it. If you found this video eye-opening, please like, share, and subscribe to Exploring Our Planet. Let us know in the comments which of these stories shocked you the most. Together, let's continue uncovering the hidden truths about our world.